Good morning. My name is Mary Tooley, and I go by she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with long, dark brown, straight hair. I'm currently wearing a gingham shirt that has pink and blue stripes. And I'm sitting here in my very mint green bedroom, and I've got pearl earrings on. Here is my presentation, Righting a Wrong, the experience of a killjoy in participatory theater. I hope you enjoy. To join in a participatory theater experience, the audience needs to accept the invitation to cross the fourth wall and become a player, as Gareth White mentions in his book, Audience Participation in the Theater, Aesthetics of the Invitation. But what happens when aspects of our participation are unethical or at odds with our political or social values? Accustomed to decades of proscenium theater experiences, being a good audience has become synonymous with receiving performances in silence, at a static distance, and with applause. As Deirdre Hedden, Helene Ball, and Rachel Zarahan discuss in their article, Come Closer, Confessions of Intimate Spectators in One-to-One Performance. People tend to have a resistance to refusal. In a performance called The Garden of Adrian in 2009, Rachel Zarahan ate a strawberry offered to her, despite despising strawberries. She realized that she acquiesced to the invitation because she was always taught to be a good girl. So she wanted to respond with kindness to a guide who had offered her such care and attention in the performance. How do we understand the potential discomfort, even shame, involved in saying no within a Canadian society that promotes the improvisation mentality of yes and? How do we communicate meaningfully and authentically when we live in a society consumed with people pleasing and the concept of likability being linked to agreeability? We are trained to suppress our questions and concerns, to refrain from challenging the methods or intentions of the artists in front of us. Gareth White mentions that there are few things in the theater that are more despised than audience participation. And yet, the success of a performance relies on the interpretation, interaction, experience, and behavior of an audience. The killjoy, a refuser of the invitation in participatory theater, who is frequently viewed as merely a buzzkill, a righteous know-it-all, or a tattletale, combats an audience's tendency to become complacent in unethical moments. Excuse me. A killjoy says the unsayable, brings politics into an apolitical space, and places us in positions of discomfort that necessitate action. It takes courage to become a killjoy. They risk disrupting the play's momentum, humiliating artists, and ruining an often expensive theatrical experience for others. In my research work for Dr. Jen Stevenson and Mariah Horner on their project on participatory theater entitled Play, Dramaturgies of Participation, I explored the intricacies and dynamics of acquiescing to the invitation, the possibility that lies in saying yes, the thrill of participation, and the decision to leap fearlessly and without preparation into unknown territories on stage. I then pivoted to an investigation into the negative of the invitation, into the power that exists in refusing the offering and the political nature of non-participation. What does it mean if we say no instead of yes? I considered a variety of different modes of saying no, differentiating the social and political meaning and impact of refusal, opting out, going rogue, being a killjoy, non-participation, or simply an inability to participate. In a nutshell, I confronted the tyranny of the invitation. I created a book that I lovingly call the Bird Book, hence all of the bird images in this presentation, on personas of refusal, which included entries on the killjoy, the rogue, the spoil sport, the one who opts out, the cheat, and the oxygen thief. I compare these personas to various birds in nature, which are in reference to Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Millen's Lesbian National Parks and Services Field Guide to North America, Flora, Fauna, and Survivor Skills. As you'll see in these images that I've created, I unpack their goals, who they affect, how they follow the rules of a show, and whether or not they accept the magic circle of the world presented. However, for this particular presentation, I of course want to focus solely on the characteristics, function, and impact of the killjoy on participatory theater. So, what can the invitation look like? Well, these can be implicitly delivered or explicitly offered. You can be demanded, inspired, implored, or coerced into participation. Many participatory performances send out pre-show email invitations, which outline the rules and expectations of interaction. Some online shows ask that one's camera and microphone remain turned on throughout because participation is necessary for the show to function and succeed. Some provide a guide throughout the show who offers accommodations, reiterates invitations, or is merely there to offer in-the-moment support. Many DLT shows remind audiences, as you can see in the screenshot here, that they will be running around Toronto, so pack lightly and wear your running shoes. Performances dealing with tricky and traumatic content sometimes relay a hefty trigger warning whilst providing links to mental health resources, while others leave you completely in the dark. Not all of these shows, however, prepare for the heterogeneity of their audiences. Not all are equipped to deal with accessibility issues. Not all have the resources, the training, the preparation to offer accommodations to those requiring it. Not all provide the agency or a safe space for opting out if one is unable to participate, made uncomfortable by the invitation, or felt overly challenged by it, or left frankly bored, unstimulated, or uninterested in the show. And in these moments of discomfort, sometimes, if we're lucky, the refuser in the role of the killjoy may take form. When participating in a one-on-one performance called Soon Tomorrow Maybe in 2021, which involved a telephone call with a woman who claimed to be my mother, I resisted following through with a desire to refuse her invitations. I should preface the story with the fact that I found this piece to be very powerful and memorable, but it was distressing at times. The mother invaded my personal space, telling me that she resented me for coming into the world and for disrupting her freedom as a woman. Her stories about me were so universal in nature that I couldn't help but place myself in them. The theatrical frame was continually thinning, and I became emotionally incapable of separating the fiction from my own reality. With a shaky voice, the mother begged for my forgiveness as her daughter. I wanted to hang up, to end the conversation, to confess it was all too painful for me, all too real. But I held on and continued listening because somewhere deep down, I knew I was in a show. I didn't want to ruin the show to hurt the actor or the character's feelings. I too, like Rachel Zarahan, was taught to be a good girl. And that is a persona that I'm constantly and consciously practicing shedding from myself. And while in the pre-show invitation, it gave me the choice to opt out at any time, the actor did not reiterate this invitation once the show began. Opting out felt cruel to the actor performing the piece and uncooperative. Perhaps I felt this so intensely because I was the only audience member. So I remained. Having studied Sarah Ahmed's work, I wanted to be defiant, to speak my truth, and to reveal the danger in this show, which dangles so closely towards the real. But let me just get back to the slide. But I silenced myself, fearing the damage I might cause by confronting an actor so seemingly invested in her role. Ahmed states in her book entitled Living a Feminist Life that life can be what killjoys are fighting for, and it is imperative that we support the fragile and care for them in our pursuits. Is refraining from our killjoy impulses and instead protecting the emotions of a nervous actor a killjoy act in itself? If we choose to preserve joy when it protects the weak, are we still fighting the cause of a killjoy who ultimately intends to leave the world a kinder, safer, and more connected place than they found it? Or are we merely censoring ourselves out of a fear of rocking the boat? In not fighting for ourselves, are we remaining complacent in the face of injustice? But how do we access the killjoy spirit and confidence when situations of mistreatment render us helpless and fragile? What brings us to feminism is what is potentially shattering, writes Ahmed. She recalls a moment while jogging where a male cyclist rode up next to her, placing his hands on the back of her shorts. Eventually, he took his hands off and rode away. Ahmed describes the encounter as making her feel sick, invaded, confused, upset, and angry. She no longer felt safe in her community. From then onward, she began to approach everyday pursuits with nervousness. A traumatic memory like this, which remains present in the body despite a desire to bury it away, can precipitate one's transformation into becoming a feminist killjoy. Ahmed reminds us that killjoys have a need for self-preservation that is often confused for self-indulgence. In a situation like this, where one already feels small and powerless for being singled out, it can be both overwhelming and emotional to draw more attention to the self. Killjoy behavior can be deemed selfish and attention-seeking, so it's often easier to maintain silence in situations of fear. Ahmed also discusses in a post on her blog, Feminist Killjoys, that we are typically taught as children that positive thinkers achieve great success. They're viewed as logical and sound. On the other hand, we are reminded that those with a negative outlook create their own obstacles through their unruly attitudes, becoming inevitably inflexible and unreasonable. No wonder we are so accustomed to giving good audience, as Helen Ebal defines it. Ahmed asserts that these claims, which unfairly determine one's potential to succeed, are in fact incredibly dangerous. As she states, what is threatening is what you're supposed to overlook to do well. Our purposeful obliviousness to the injustices surrounding us may make us complacent, inactive, and accepting of the wrongdoings made against us. Ahmed relates this idea to feminism. As women, we are shown that those who lead with positivity are praised and celebrated, while those who question unfair systems and practices are either silenced, ignored, shamed, villainized, or reduced to offensive terms such as nags, complainers, or bitches. In Ahmed's Killjoy survival kit, she mentions that in order to become one, you must accept your actual feelings by allowing yourself to resist the societally driven urge to be unwaveringly loyal and joyful, and to permit your body to dance and to wiggle in order to create space for the killjoy to thrive. In hoping to become a feminist killjoy myself, I have begun creating my own Killjoy survival kit. I surround myself with objects and people and books that empower me. I keep the possessions of the strong women who came before me as reminders that I am supported by them. Jewelry and furniture of my mom and my two grandmothers fill my space. And I, like Ahmed, keep feminist literature that inspires me around my room. The Brontes, George Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Alice Munro, Judith Butler, bell hooks, to name a few. I wear a friendship ring that I share with my friend who inspires me. In my day-to-day life, I practice speaking my mind and embodying a more open and confident physicality. I want to wiggle and to dance bravely into those spaces that allow for the killjoy to exist and to flourish. The killjoy's motives are often constructive and rooted in political activism. While their course of action may cause audience discomfort and unwanted interruption or awkwardness through their complaints, they address inequities, unhealthy power dynamics, or harassment experienced during the performance. Killjoys question the blind faith we place in our procedural artists and ask whether the artist actually knows what is best for their audience. They invite participants to stop the momentum of a performance in order to do the deep work, to combat a lazy desire to fall into complacency, to stand up for themselves and their beliefs, and to offer improvements to situations that are carelessly constructed or unkind in nature. The killjoy hopes to emancipate marginalized groups and voices and to create more feminist spaces. As Ahmed explained, when one endeavors to combat acts of violence and discrimination, harassment is used as a tool to further silence and oppress victims. The killjoy challenges abusive or unjust situations, and while their accusations may cause embarrassment to an audience engaged in a fiction that enables injustice, their interventions are designed to draw attention to the acts of cruelty we often become complicit in due to fear, ignorance, or even that morbid curiosity of witnessing another's pain. And this is where I arrive at a case study of Recurrent Theater's New Societies, a participatory piece that invites participants to imagine a utopia in a colonial gameplay context. Brian Postallion's immersive and interactive, sometimes digital, sometimes in-person experience asks players who are divided into groups of societies to engage in a strategic board game that instructs them to build their own ideal new society. I interviewed a former participant who attended various iterations of the show, noticing colonial language embedded in the phrasing of the game's questions. The current and historical implications of statements regarding mole people and questions surrounding how to control increased birth rates made them wonder if they could ethically participate and play if it is merely just a game. One question in the performance asks, your division is considering building a community space. Resolve to build one that is A, minimal and free for 2 resources, B, free exclusively for the use of underrepresented groups for 2 resources, or C, highly developed with a membership fee for 1 resource. Of course, it costs the group fewer resources to establish a highly developed community space that has a membership fee, and one that therefore is not accessible to all, but instead strategically benefits the already privileged. Could this player set aside their real-world values in this scenario? In this first attendance of New Societies, they observed the game unfold, remained silent, and wondered if anyone else had considered the real-world consequences of their actions in the game. It's challenging to speak up when we're unsure whether our viewpoints will be supported or if instead we will be humiliated for taking the game too seriously. The player returned to the performance for a second round, prepared to think critically about the content offered. They noticed another player who seemed uncomfortable too. The other player seemed hesitant to make choices that would replicate historical injustices or harm the underrepresented. So our player reached out to this person via a direct message, asking her if she too noticed the real world implications of this game. Confirmation of shared concerns encouraged the player to speak up about the team's tendencies to support colonialist thinking through their decision-making practices. This player embodied the role of the Killjoy by voicing their concerns regarding their teammates' unethical behavior. And while a moment of discomfort ensued, their honesty allowed for a much more meaningful conversation to be had about the implications of this game and of its real-world relevance. This show is politically charged and provocative. The currency and contentiousness of its colonialist foundations seem to actually invite participants into engaging with Killjoy-like behavior. The Killjoy participant didn't break the show, but instead initiated a productive conversation that explored the show's deeper meanings and themes. And as creator Brian Postalian mentions in an interview recently with CBC, he wants players to leave the game initiating larger conversations of whether or not we need to create a new society or what we could do to create the one that we want or deserve. He wants people to consider how they are implicated in more than just a theoretical way. He goes on to say at the end of the discussion that to create a better world, we have to actively be challenging the systems in ways that we are then providing options. His show seems in many ways to inspire the emergence of this questioner, of this Killjoy activist. And when I think back on that question about building a community space that either supports the privileged or at a greater cost will benefit underrepresented groups, I recall Ahmed, who paints privilege as this buffer zone whereby all people encounter the possibility of failure in their endeavors, but some possess support systems that help build them back up, while others face a higher degree of vulnerability. It can be easier to take on the role of the Killjoy when you know you will have support to rely on, regardless of whether your actions are accepted favorably or not. Friends who arrive together at this show are separated into various teams when they play, which equalizes players in some ways, ridding them of the privilege of playing in the presence of someone they're familiar with, who can either make their participation feel more or less easy, free, and comfortable. But what is for certain, Postalian asserts, is that friends leave the show embarking on fascinating discussions about being forced to meet people and then to break out of the bubble that they are used to. The participants' Killjoy actions make me wonder, how do artists prepare for refusal? How do they ensure the fate of the show does not completely reside in the participants' hands if a certain conclusion is necessary? Or on the other hand, how can they subtly invite refusal? And how do we as participants gather the courage to speak up, even when it disrupts the show? How do we wiggle, as Ahmed imagistically states, into unwanted spaces without the expected joy of a participant and instead encourage important debate? How do we establish spaces that embrace discomfort and disagreement? A refusal of the invitation provides us with new questions as theater practitioners. And because resistance compels us to glean insight on the effectiveness of our art, implores us to unpack the meaning behind each specific detail in our performances, and entreats us to analyze the aspects of our show which call for structural or content improvement and transformation, the Killjoy's refusal has the potential to be productive, to right a wrong. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.